The winner of the 2017 CPCAB Counselling Research Award was Tracey Fuller. Tracy is a teaching fellow at the University of Sussex, and she conducted her research as part of her PhD. Counsellor and psychotherapist Barry Kopp spoke to Tracy about her work.
So this is a piece of research looking at how we work alongside young people when sharing their information in order to keep them safe in school counselling contexts. It came out of my experience working as a school counsellor and how stressful those situations can be when you're trying to keep an alliance going with a young person, when you may be having to share information in order to keep them safe, and maybe they don't want you to pass that information on to another professional.
So I'm wondering, from what you're seeing from that, is the stress for the counsellor and for the young person?
Yeah, I think stress on both sides, and I guess stress and strain on the alliance itself, on the therapeutic alliance, potentially.
And I wonder how you went about the research.
Well, the methodology I used was it's called phronesis, and is really interested in the contextual wisdom that practitioners and that actually people have in their context. So I was interested in the wisdom of different groups and what they bring to this idea of information sharing from counselling sessions. So I was interested in the wisdom of school counsellors and what they could tell us about how to work alongside young people in these situations and keep the trust going. I was interested in school safeguarding officers, who are often teachers, and what wisdom they could impart about these situations. And I was also interested in the wisdom of young people who've had counselling experience. So they've been through counselling and maybe they've experienced initial contracting. So what we talk about is confidential unless you share something that shows that you're at risk or you're likely to be harmed. So these were young people who'd had this experience, and I was interested to see what wisdom they would bring to thinking about how to make these situations the best that they can and protect the alliance.
So something about those three groups of people, the child protection officers, the counsellor, the client as a young person, their lived experience.
Yeah, and bringing those different groups, the wisdom of those different groups together in a kind of polyphony of voices. And in order to do that, I constructed a information sharing vignette, which was like a fictional vignette about a girl called Lucy, whose mum stays out overnight and goes down the pub, and she's left by herself looking after her younger children in the family. And that enabled the counsellors to talk about a specific situation without having to disclose information of their clients. It gave a focus for the safeguarding officers, but it also allowed the young people to talk about Lucy and her situation and how they felt the counsellor should work with Lucy, rather than talk about their own situation. So it was an ethical device. So the counsellors said how they'd like to work with Lucy. Safeguarding officers gave their views about working with Lucy, and then I asked the young people how they thought the counsellor should work with Lucy. And then the other element to that was I made a short video of the views specifically of the school counsellors and the safeguarding officers to play to the young people so that they could see what the adults thought, what the adults had to say about how they thought they should work with Lucy to keep the trust going, so they could critique the adults' ideas. So not only give their own ideas, but as an accessible method that allowed them to critique the adults' ideas as well. So I was hoping that all of those sets of eyes could be brought to bear on safeguarding information sharing and how to keep alliances going through that process.
The young people's responses involved themes such as trust, confidentiality, and transparent communication. Here are some examples of what the young people said.
If you don't have trust with the counsellor, then it's going to make you feel worse, because you're not going to say the things you want to say, and get help with. And if you button up, if you're keeping it in, then it's going to make it worse. So it's always good for the first couple of sessions to always get that bond first before you go straight into the counselling.
They should tell you if they're going to pass it on or not. That's why the contract is there. Not right, okay, and then you suddenly get pulled out of class and made to talk about it.
Tracy also asked the young people to write their thoughts on post-it notes.
I think you should give them options on what they want to do, e.g., would you like me to pass this information on or not? You don't want people to talk about you behind your back. Don't take it into your own hands. What came out was a lot of stuff about trust. I mean, the young people had a lot to say about trust and how important it was and how it was the thing that enabled young people to share. You know, trust in the therapeutic relationship enabled young people to disclose their concerns and that it takes time to develop. But they did really associate it with confidentiality, which obviously brings up how complex this is as an area. You know, if you're sharing information, obviously that piece of information is no longer confidential. The other thing the young people talked about was just what a dilemma it was to make disclosures. You know, when I originally thought about this research, I thought it would be the counsellors who were experiencing the dilemmas, the dilemma about whether to share information or not. But that's not what came out. It sat with the young people who were, well, is it going to get better? If I tell this counsellor this, it's going to get better, or am I going to be in a worse situation? And the young people did talk about how, you know, if one piece of information was passed on, it might make them less likely to disclose more information. So there was quite a bit of discussion about that.
So there's sort of two things there, isn't there? There's trust in the counsellor, trust almost in themselves as well. But I've got to build trust, and then I think what I'm hearing you saying is, what do I disclose as the client, the young person? If I disclose this, is this going to make me feel better, or am I going to feel worse? Or if it gets passed on, will that then stop me disclosing other things?
The young people talked about the domino effect, actually. That, you know, that fear that if something came out, there would be this domino effect, that they would then lose control.
Control for what's going on inside of them or outside of their control?
The process would be outside of their control.
So what happens to that information?
What happens to the information? Who it's going to get spoken to? And what they wanted, and although there were a range of views, you know, across that range of views, what the young people wanted was to feel involved in that information sharing process. They wanted counsellors who were transparent with them. So they talked about the importance of initial contracting. They said, yes, those initial contracts that limit confidentiality and less them at risk, they're really important, and they liked them because they thought they were quite equal and respectful, but they were very clear that they're not sufficient. That there's just because you do a contract at the beginning, that doesn't give license to share young people's information without further engaging with them about the fact that their information is going to get shared.
So the fear is almost, yes, we've done the contract, you've explained the limits of confidentiality, but then my fear is you're going to just disclose that information then without reminding me or telling me or involving me.
Yeah, and the young people were really clear they want to be told. They want to be told, and they wanted counsellors who were honest and upfront. And actually the counsellors said this. You know, when I asked the counsellors what they thought would help keep the trust going in alliances, they said being honest and upfront and transparent. And the young people, you know, this is something that the adults and the young people completely agreed on. And what the young people had to say about that was that it actually helps them lower their anxiety. If they know exactly what's going to be said, if they know who it's going to be said to, And some young people talked about actually being present, you know, when information gets passed perhaps to a school safeguarding officer, actually being in the room so that you hear what's being said. And the young people I talked to, who ranged between 12 to 16 really, they really wanted to know, and it was really important to them to know what exactly was being said. So that communication was very important, but also they wanted counsellors not to stop talking to them. I know that sounds funny. They wanted counsellors to engage with them about what the concern was, especially if it was a concern that the counsellor had and the young person didn't have. So both the counsellors and the young people, though they use different language, talked about this idea of saying, the counsellors called this unnormalising. Why is this thing that's happening, thinking about Lucy's mum staying out all night, why is that not okay for me? The young people talked about saying to Lucy, like, look, this is serious, this is affecting your education. So the idea that there's conversations and a to and fro, an engagement about the concern, rather than, oh, this is terrible, this shouldn't happen to you, I'm going to tell somebody else. The young people wanted a dialogue.
So if I can just hold that for a moment, there's something about having a dialogue, but also why am I, as the counsellor, concerned about this enough that I need to make a disclosure, or I need to pass it on.
Yeah.
And if I somehow have that dialogue with the young person is aware of what's being said, but I guess maybe you can also correct the counsellor if the counsellor's got it wrong. Exactly,
and that's exactly what the young people said about that. We want to hear it because they might get it wrong, they might say it wrong. And I that was really, really interesting, actually. But they wanted to be taken through the process. And there was a slight difference of opinion between the counsellors and the young people on this. In fact, all of the counsellors I spoke to said, at some point, it's more containing to just say, well, you know, you go back to class and I'm going to sort this out. And the young people were adamant that that is not good for them, that just provokes anxiety, that they actually wanted that conversation, they wanted dialogue.
I'm not sure I fully understood that having been transparent with the young person and saying I've got to make a disclosure because of X, Y, and Z, and then saying I'm going to deal with this without involving the client any further?
Yeah, so what the young people wanted was they liked the counsellors, in thinking of them reflecting on the videos that were made, they liked the counsellors who were concerned with their empowerment, who gave them options, who asked them if they wanted to come with them to the safeguarding officer, who were prepared to, and what it was about really was about retaining a focus on the young person's concern. I mean, it's kind of empathy, really. It's maintaining the empathy. You know, what is the young person worried about in the here and now, and not losing that focus.
Or even what is it the young person needs?
And what do they think they want to happen next? You know, what do they want? Even if, and this was the interesting thing, even if the counsellor disagrees, with the young person, even if the young person says, well, I'm fine, I don't need anything, and the counsellor thinks, well, no, actually this isn't okay, that process of dialogue is what's important. That engagement, it seems to be what counts. And the young people said things like, well, even if they don't agree, even if they can't do everything that Lucy wants, remembering Lucy, the girl's mum, stays out all night, they try to give her options. They're listening to what she thinks. They're interested in her opinion.
So it's something about being interested in what the young person feels they want and that they felt heard, even if the action I have to take as a counsellor is not what the young person would wish, but at least I have discussed that and heard the young person in some way,
Yes.
even if I have to do something that the young person doesn't want me to do.
And absolutely. And
And
that changes something. I mean, that's what it was very interesting. I talked to 2 different groups of young people. And there was some things that were shared across both groups. They both wanted support. They both wanted reassurance. They both wanted, things to be focused on the young person. And they both wanted transparency and honesty. But there were some differences between those 2 different groups of young people. And one of my groups of young people were very hard line. They were no consent for information being passed on, no sharing. And my other group of young people were, well, maybe Lucy will be really upset and cross at the time, but she'll thank the counsellor later for when things get better in her life. But even the group that were very no consent, no passing on of information, their understanding of consent and what they had to say about consent was not perhaps as I would understand consent. Consent for them was about dialogue, being respected, being heard. One of the key concepts from this research is the idea of counsellors maintaining their availability to young people through safeguarding information
so
sharing.
not slamming the door and going off and I've got to disclose, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, but somehow maintaining the focus on the young person, the relationship, the dialogue, the transparency.
Yeah, maintaining that focus, maintaining empathy, continuing to be psychologically available. And there was a practical element to that as well. So counsellors who were able to be a bit flexible and have time to go to the safeguarding officer with the young person, or who were able to offer a bit of extra support in between sessions. Young people talked about that. But it was the psychological availability. Rather than, I'm taking this out of your hands. What the young people said to me is, don't take this out of our hands. Rather than a sense that that was happening, even that group who said, no consent, no sharing, when I played a video of a counsellor trying to work alongside, talking about working alongside a young person, giving them options, they were okay with that. They're like, okay, it's not exactly what I want, but that they're still focused on the young person. They're interested in what she has to say. There's still a relationship there. And that seemed to be the thing that enabled that information sharing to be okay in those young people's eyes.
And I'm wondering, when you're saying that, if there becomes a point where a counsellor or even the young person thinks, actually, why are we sharing this? It's almost there's a level where disclosure has to be made or not made.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to those conversations about why is this not okay for you, which one of my counselling participants described as unnormalising. The young people themselves talked about, they use words like convincing Lucy that this information needs to be passed on, that her life would be better, that she should expect better. She should be allowed to be a child. And
so it needs to be contextualised in some way.
Yeah. And it's, the idea that all of our childhoods are normal until we set it in another context. You should be able to expect more from your life.
So I'm wondering, from what you've been saying, that almost something goes back to the very start of the Therapeutic Alliance when we're contracting, and wondering how explicit disclosure or limits to confidentiality need to be at that point.
It's a very interesting thing, this. as I said earlier, the young people liked those contracts, and they felt they did need to be clear. But they talked about the fact that sometimes young people make disclosures. Well, in fact, both the counsellors and the young people said this, that sometimes young people make disclosures without realising they're making disclosures. So that young people need reminders. You know, they need reminders of that contract. Because one of the young people said to me, well, sometimes you say things just because you're scared and it just tumbles out. And then once it's tumbled out, you can't put it back in. So at that point, it's not only about reminding young people about the contract, the initial contract, and the school counsellors talked a lot about that. That if they were working with the fictional Lucy, they would remind her about that initial contract. That's great, but there needs more information. So one of the counsellors I worked with in those initial contracts was more explicit in terms of saying, if you share something that shows that you're in danger, I'm going to tell this particular person, and named the school safeguarding officer and the role that they had. So they had a kind of freeway contract, and made it a bit more problematic because the Place2Be, which is the organisation I did this research in, which is the largest school counselling provider in the UK, they have a system where they have experienced counsellors and volunteer counsellors in schools, and the experienced counsellors supervise the work of the volunteer counsellors. So all the participants that I talked to were those experienced counsellors who are called practice managers. So if a young person makes a disclosure in a session, if that happens with a volunteer, that information then has to go back to the supervisor, to the experienced counsellor. And so there's another person in that loop. And certainly one of my counsellors named everything in the initial contract. So if you tell your counsellor, if this wasn't the person that they were working with, it will come back to me, and then we'll involve Mrs. Such and Such, who's the safeguarding officer, who will have to know, and then they will make a decision about, what needs to happen with that information. So some of the young people said to me, don't do those initial contracts in such a way as it scares young people off of making disclosures. So you can't go into so much detail that it actually puts young people off, because they need to share their concerns if there's something they're worried about. So, and young people were quite keen on the idea of, I guess as counsellors we might not like this, but reassuring, young clients that this will help them, this will make their life better. Of course that's quite problematic, but the young people are quite keen on that as a concept.
Well, I suppose we can't really guarantee that it's going to make anything any better. But I suppose what's coming out of that is, being explicit from the very start is useful, so we all know where the boundaries are. But when a disclosure does need to be made, it's how we keep that young person involved so they feel empowered and part of that process. Even if they might disagree with it, they feel they've been part of it.
That they're still respected. Because I think the Therapeutic Alliance, it is a unique relationship. And it's about continuing to be a therapist and continuing to have that unique, respectful alliance with somebody, even when you've got an eye on safeguarding at the same time.
I'm just wondering, taking everything that we said into account, I'm wondering about the stress and the strain that might put on the counsellor.
Well, that's really interesting actually, because the second part of my data analysis really focused on the situation of the school counsellors and focused on the emotional reality and the relational reality of working in schools and working in these safeguarding child protection situations. I looked, for example, at the feelings that were named by school counsellors. So they talked about anxiety, they talked about anger, they talked about guilt, they talked about concern and shame. Lots of very powerful negative feelings are around, obviously for young people, but also for school counsellors in these situations. And some of those feelings might be counter-transferential, they might originate in the young person, and some of them might originate in being in these situations where you're trying to protect an alliance and you have to do something your client might not want you to do. So thinking about this idea about counsellor availability, counsellor psychological availability through child protection information sharing, how can counsellors stay available? Because that's what the young people were saying they wanted. They wanted to still feel like their counsellors were counsellors and were available for them. So what actually emerged in my kind of narrative analysis was that sometimes counsellors become very preoccupied by following the correct child protection protocol in school environments. There's a lot of anxiety around child protection, and it can become very preoccupying, and counsellors feel they've got to get it right. They've got to get it right. Especially if they don't feel particularly supported, or if they don't have a good relationship with their school safeguarding officer, or their school safeguarding officer is kind of difficult to get hold of, unavailable themselves. Those counsellors in my study showed the most anxiety, and it came out in their narratives, it came out in the way they talked about safeguarding, and it came out in their preoccupation with protocol and emails and form filling. There was a loss of focus on the relationship with the young people sometimes for these counsellors. So counsellors who were unsupported and felt isolated. So this has kind of led me to think, when thinking about my data, that actually counsellors, in order to stay available through these processes, this is when young people are their potentially most vulnerable, to stay available, they need to have sufficient containment and support. If feeling contained, William Bion talks about how feeling contained is connected to the ability to reflect. We've got cognitive free space. If you don't feel contained, if you're anxious, if you don't know how you're going to get hold of your safeguarding officer, if you don't know if they're going to listen to you or take you seriously, or how they're going to talk to the young person when that information gets passed on, you're likely to have less reflective space, and you're likely to be less available for the young people. And that's what came out in the data.
So if I can just try and see if I've understood that, there's something about the process of disclosure outweighing perhaps the work that I'm doing with my client, that somehow the balance tips, and I'm getting consumed in some way by, can I get hold of this person who's the child protection officer? What do I need to do? Do I need to disclose this? Should I disclose this? What's going to happen? That I disconnect from the client in some way, and that causes my own anxiety, my own stress, my own guilt.
Yeah. So for counsellors who didn't feel supported, that seemed to be what emerged in my data. It was like an on-off switch. If you can imagine, there's an on switch for safeguarding and an off switch for the Therapeutic Alliance. It was like it just went all over to safeguarding, and the Therapeutic Alliance got
And
dropped.
that's when I withdraw from my client because I become absorbed in the safeguarding
And a focus
issue.
on adult processes. A focus on getting it right and on adult processes. And young people are very sensitive to that off switch. And actually, ideally, what you need to be able to do is to hold the stuff around, the protocol and what I need to do and who I need to talk to and who I need to get hold of, while staying available to the young people. And the counsellors who achieved this best were the ones who felt supported.
Supported by the
school. Had good working relationships with their safeguarding officers, met them regularly, felt trusted by them and trusted their safeguarding officers. One of the school counsellors in their narrative talked about, who can I trust to take care of me so I can take care of the young people I'm working with? And the counsellors who did feel supported, and part of that was to do with the relationship with the safeguarding officer, but also supervision, and peer supervision was very important as well. Those counsellors seemed to be more focused on the young people and the relationship with the young people. They seemed to be able to retain that focus on the therapy and on the alliance, rather than just switching over and just focusing on protocol.
So there's something about actually the relationship I have with that young person is my primary concern. And even though this switch into child protection is important, actually I need to maintain that therapeutic alliance, keep the client engaged, remain emotionally available for the client, and at the same time hold the adult stuff that I have to do, but that shouldn't impact on my therapeutic work.
And that's much easier to achieve
if I'm supported.
If you get support, if you've got good supervision. And I guess it's not just about the trust in the room with the young person. The trust is the work, is the title of this research. It's also about the trust that they're going to get supported, that the school counsellors are going to be supported, that trust that the safeguarding officer is going to be available, trust that they're going to be able to talk about their worries in supervision or with their peers, that there's the system needs to have trust in it. The adult system needs to have trust in order for that trust to happen, to be maintained.
So as I'm holding the young person as the counsellor, I also need to be held not only by my supervisor, but somehow by the child protection officer, safeguarding officer, and trust that the safeguarding officer is going to be able to hold the young person in some regard as well. Yeah,
and it was really noticeable that the counsellor who had a safeguarding officer, when I interviewed the safeguarding officer from this counsellor, the safeguarding officer said, I want the counsellor to be able to sleep at night. I want them to be able to go home and not take this home. I want them to be able to go home and just live their life. And that safeguarding officer was really aware of the impact of these situations and wanted to make sure that, the counsellor could, sleep at night.
And that's interesting because we haven't really talked a lot about the safeguarding officers and that they were part of your research.
They were part of my study because they're part of the system. They're part of the whole system. They had, unfortunately, I only interviewed a couple of them, and I regret that. It's a limitation of my study. It wasn't for want of trying, and that's kind of tantamount to how busy and stretched those professionals are. But the ones I did talk to, one of them was very, very concerned about young people's participation, and one of them was less concerned about young people's participation. But they both had good working relationships. with their school counsellors, and felt those relationships were really important in providing a kind of overall service for the young people in the school. I think there's a study to be done. I think there have been studies done on what it's like for those school safeguarding officers, because the truth is they don't get any supervision, or very, very limited supervision. And one of the safeguarding officers I talked to was going to just about to leave the role, because she felt very overwhelmed by the volume of referrals that she was getting and the lack of support that she felt. So it's the whole system.
I guess the decision remains with them, doesn't it, of what to do with it.
Yes.
So it's not just about the counsellor disclosing to the safeguarding officer. The safeguarding officer then has to make a decision what to do with it.
But what seemed to be helpful was when there was some sort of mutuality between the two of them. There was a to and fro. And some of the counsellors talked about how they kind of provided a bit of supervision for their safeguarding officers. Because it's really strange this, but ironically, because the safeguarding officers knew that the counsellors would keep it confidential, they would share some of their worries with the counsellor. And there was a kind of mutual support situation going on. And mutual respect in those different professional roles, I think, is really crucial here. And where that exists, there's less preoccupation on the part of the counsellor. They're less full of anxiety, less full of how am I going to pass this on, how am I going to get this young person protected and safe.
So if I can have a relationship as a counsellor with the safeguarding officer, it makes things smoother. If it feels like a battle, or there's a big distance or disconnect, then it becomes more heavy, I guess is a word, heavy.
Well, difficult. Stressful. Anxiety provoking. And, if we're full of anxiety, then there's less space for the young person.
And I think that's actually something that's quite important, is that young people can pick up on things quite well. They're very receptive. If I'm there for you as a young person, they will receive that in some way and they will respond to it. The minute I pull away, they will pull away as well.
Absolutely. And they sense the off switch. And one of my counsellors was talking about, she was expressing frustration about some referring on kind of disclosures around self-harm, that the school had a policy of referring on if there were any disclosures of self-harm within the counselling session. So the referral would go to CAMS. And the counsellor was talking about how frustrating she found that, and how she was concerned about the impact of that on the Therapeutic Alliance that had enabled the disclosure about the self-harm in the first place. And she talked about young people saying, well, I've just told you, you're going to tell somebody else? I wish I hadn't bothered. And that there's that actually young people choose to make disclosures within relationships of trust. And therefore those relationships of trust are really, really valuable and important and vital. That ultimately you keep young people safer if you can create trusting relationships. Coming back to the conversation about engaging young people, talking to them about why they might need extra help, why it might be that actually this isn't great for them, that there's a lot of space in there to have conversations about it. So it's not a polarity. It's not a kind of conversation that happens in one moment where you say, oh, you're cutting. Okay, then I'm going to pass that on. End of conversation. It's about an engagement about that process.
And I think what I picked up from what you said there, something about actually what are the support can I offer or can be offered to support you with what you've disclosed?
Yeah, yes, exactly. And it's about having conversations about that.
And I guess it's also about whether I can guarantee additional support or not.
Yeah, which is a huge issue in terms of access to services. And the kind of, but what young people seem to value from my study is that is a process. That's an engagement process. It's not, oh, I want to get you extra help and you don't want extra help, end of conversation. That there's a continual conversation going on there, and that engagement and engaging at that level is part of what we have to offer as therapists. So it's about not stopping being therapists when kind of issues of safety arise.
So
and in fact, there are therapeutic opportunities in that. You know, there's therapeutic opportunities in trying to empower young people and through risky situations. I think Andrew Reeves talks about this in his book, about the therapeutic opportunities of risk. You know, if this is where young people, or this is where people are most vulnerable, then that's an enormous therapeutic opportunity to do something positive, rather than just take the power away.
So how can I maintain a positive working relationship with the client and not disempower them?
Yeah.
Or break the therapeutic alliance
Or break
in some
the
ways.
therapeutic alliance, even if they're kind of unhappy about it. What can you explain? How can you talk about it? How can you engage with it?
Because I could work with the unhappiness about it as well.
Yeah. You can work with the unhappiness, but not if they have a sense that everything's just been, that the whole board's been tipped over and the game's different.
So I need to work with what's there in that moment.
Yeah.
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 Nice. I'm wondering, from the research that you've done, if you feel there was any limitations or gaping questions that came out of the research.
Well, for a start, it was a very small scale qualitative study. You know, I can't generalise from this study, but for me, what I'd like to go on to do, and what I think would be fantastic, though ethically very challenging, but I'd quite like to, meet that ethical challenge, is do some research working alongside young people whose information has been shared from counselling sessions, from school counselling sessions, and talk to them about their experiences.
And the effect.
In a kind of in a more in-depth way. Now, obviously, that is incredibly sensitive, challenging territory, but I just feel that there would be so much in young people talking about their actual experiences, and maybe, ideally, it would be great to then see what the counsellors themselves has to say about those actual experiences. But so a more focused, in-depth, closer in look at situations that have happened. And I guess, one of the reasons why I got into this field in the first place is one of my first jobs was working with young people in care who had so much to say about how they felt about everybody knowing their business. And I was quite a young counsellor at the time, and I remember my clients talking about these, this is back a while, before the internet, about these kind of manila folders that social workers would carry around about the young people that contained all their information, some horrific information, some information maybe the young person didn't know. And these folders seem to symbolise this idea of them being passed around.
This is you.
This is you. And they're always grubby and fat with bits of papers falling out. And it was what everyone knew about them. And those young clients that I worked with, they had so much to say about how uncomfortable they found that. Yes, they wanted the support, but the idea of people talking about them without knowing
what's being said and what information's held on me.
Yeah. So I guess that's kind of part of my journey to this piece of research, actually.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if you could just say a little bit maybe about why research is important.
Generally.
Oh!
Research is important because counselling is important. Because, research in counselling is ethically difficult and ethically necessary. Because we have a responsibility to our clients to know what we're doing and know how we're doing it and why we're doing it and what that experience is like and how to make it better. Research isn't about things sitting in books. Research is about how we practice as therapists. And I'm not interested in sitting in ivory towers and publishing articles. I'm interested in developing and understanding good practice. And that's how I see the connection between research and practice.
And it's informing the profession in some way.
Informing, and also I think it's counselling, if anything, is a reflective profession, and research is an act of reflection. It's an act of thinking and looking and contemplating and investigating and thinking again. And God help us if we practice without thinking and reflecting.
And I guess, the good thing about what you've been researching is it's opened up questions and it's brought to the forefront some of the dilemmas of making disclosures when working with young people and maintaining the trust in that therapeutic alliance.
Yeah. And it's brought, for me, it's brought that connection between how important it is to stay available, psychologically available for young people, but also how important those participatory practices are that involve the young people in the process. And I think this research, although of course it's useful for developing ideas of good practice in school counselling, but I think it's not just, I think it's applicable to other professions. Those ideas about the value of trust and the value of participatory approaches to working with vulnerable young people are applicable to other professionals like social workers and school teachers and youth workers. How do we work alongside young people in these challenging situations? How do we keep trust going? Because without trust, there are no disclosures in the first place. Young people are not going to tell us or anyone the things that are worrying them.
And I suppose it's as a professional, it's something about actually we have a duty, we have a legal obligation, a statutory organisation, to disclose X, Y, and Z, certain information that come to us, but can maintain that relationship with a young person so they feel engaged, aware of what's happening to their information, and how do we support the young person through that?
And it's also I think we have to get away from this idea that disclosure is a one-time thing. What the young people that I talked to said is that they might say things, test out the response before they say the real thing. So if you do something after the initial disclosure that undermines the trust, you may never get to the real concern, the real danger that the young person is in. And trust is an ongoing thing.
But I guess that's the same with any client, isn't it? That they will tempt you with something to see how you respond to start with, and if you respond in an appropriate way, then more will come out.
Yes.
But particularly with young people in this particular instance, if you shut it down, they will shut down.
And it is complex territory because confidentiality, with young people, you're balancing that duality between their rights to be autonomous, their rights to have confidential space, with also their rights to be safe and their rights to be protected. That it's complex territory, and that's why I did this research, because this is the hard stuff. And young people have both of those rights, but there's a danger on both sides. You know, there's a danger if you drop their rights to protection, it would be very dangerous. But equally, if you drop their rights to autonomy, they're not going to talk to you. So you've got to balance. You've got to be able to hold both of those things and work that through a relationship.
And it's making those ethical, I guess, legal and procedural decisions as a therapist. And how can I somehow embody all of that in the work that I do and contain it in some ways?
And I think probably no therapist, no counsellor can do that by themselves. They need good supervision and they need good support.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today.
Yeah, pleasure to talk to you as well, actually.
Thank you.